I'm going to be asking some difficult questions that I don't have the answer to, folks.
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is sitting at the corner of my drafting table giving himself a bath. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. I wasn't able to have the scientist as a guest this week, so you're getting a news episode. I hope to have them on in a future episode. Before I get to the news, I want to talk about something which happened this past week. Now, longtime listeners to the show will know that until fairly recently, I have been scraping along financially. Indeed, I wouldn't have a place to live if it hadn't been for the help my listeners have given me when things got tight. Thankfully, with this current job, I am doing well enough that money isn't a constant worry for me. In fact, because I do have slightly more than subsistence wages coming in, I've started thinking about doing some things that I've always wanted to do, as well as exploring some new directions for podcasting. As part of this, I looked up some old friends of mine. One is an artist who I know is financially strapped right now. The other is a writer who specializes in a topic that I'm going to cover in a new podcast. Both of these people not only have had more success professionally in their respective fields than I'll ever have. You wouldn't know their names, but trust me, you've seen their work. One of them has edited a couple of international magazines, the other animated music videos for internationally known artists, as well as developing advertisements and political websites. In both cases, they turned me down. Not because the projects didn't interest them, or I wasn't offering enough money, or they were too busy. No, they turned me down because they had given up on such things. Both of them expressed themselves in such a dark manner that I immediately reached out to mutual friends who are geographically closer than I am to suggest that they go check up on our friend. Now, I have no illusions that I'll ever be able to make a living at podcasting, and I doubt that I'll be able to make at my current job what my friends were making at their peaks in their artistic fields, but I'm going to keep doing it. Why? Because if I have to choose between putting out a podcast that most people only listen to for my cat stories and living in a black pit of despair, I'm going to keep on podcasting. I know what that black pit of despair looks like. I've been down that well way too many times, even though there are times when the last thing I want to do is put together an episode or I'm unhappy with an episode. It is still far, far better than simply marking time until I die or being curled up in a fetal position, reflexively gnawing at my wrists. And I want to say that the real disappointment for me is with the woman who was the magazine editor. Her name is Eve, and probably the best way to describe her that most of you will understand is to just say that she has the wit and the scathing tongue of Christopher Hitchens. I met her through a message board, which we were both members of for a while, and then she quit the message board, and I also quit it for different reasons. But she could just rip the shit out of people, whether it be posters on that message board who said something really fucking stupid, or political figures like you wouldn't believe. In 2000, 99, 2000, somewhere around there, she did a massive post, which completely tore Joseph Lieberman to pieces. You know, and this is when he was Al Gore's running mate, so he was seen as the darling of Democrats, and Eve is most assuredly a Democrat. But she recognized from things that he had said that someone such as her, an atheist, as well as a trans woman, was somebody that Lieberman did not consider to be human. And while everybody else was cheering Gore Lieberman on, she was laying out very clearly, very succinctly, and backed up with, you know, unimpeccable links to Lieberman's own comments that, hey, whatever we may think about this guy, he is worth keeping a very strong eye on because he undermines many of the values which we as liberals, progressives, atheists, supporters of the LGBTQ community find antithetical. Just, hang on. I'm going to see if I can't find that post of hers. Nope. I just looked and their fucking search engine sucks. That's one of the reasons why I left that board, but not the only one. And I can't turn up her particular post. But she's an expert in her field, not merely in being a magazine editor, but her specialization of some of the topics that she covers as a writer professionally. She's an expert in her field. And she, you know, she's not doing anything anymore. And I just got a message back from one of our mutual friends who said, you know, I guess I'm going to check up on her. But she said, you know, Eve constantly battles depression, and part of her problem is her job. She's not really happy with her job, and there's some other issues related to it that aren't really germane to this discussion. And, you know, it makes me sad because, you know, I don't have any illusions that the podcast I'm envisioning here will be fan-fucking-tastic or, you know, a huge breakout success. But I am certain that if Eve were to join the podcast and do a couple episodes, just a couple of episodes, the people who heard the podcast and understood things about, you know, Eve, realized that she was an atheist and a few other things, she would be just, you know, she would have friends because people would love her. You know, I've often said that the one person I've met in my life who is the absolute most likable is Callie Wright. And, you know, I stand by that statement. I mean, everybody who's met Callie loves her. Eve is the same way. I've never met Eve in the flesh, but you know, and so my hope, one of the reasons why I reached out to Eve was not merely because she is an expert in her field and it was related to the podcast I wanted to do, but because I knew, gosh, you know, Eve will make so many friends. She'll have such, you know, fandom surrounding her that it'll enable her to do other things that she wants to do because she is so brilliant and so witty. But she's, you know, as I said, she's given up. So I just want to say, for those of you out there of an artistic bent, keep doing what you're doing. Don't worry about being the next Picasso, Hemingway, or whomever. Fame is a fickle beast. One of the things that I've learned from living near Nashville all these years is that talent and creativity mean absolutely nothing when it comes to who is successful. A friend of mine has worked professionally in the music industries for decades now as an engineer. One of the things that he told me after working with a singer who's had a number of platinum selling albums is that the only reason she has a career is because of her appearance and her willingness to do what she's told, no matter how many times they have to re-record a single vocal line in one of her songs. Each one of her songs is the result of producers and engineers carefully massaging each and every word so that it is in key and on tempo. Were she to show up and try to sing at an open mic night in a bar, she'd quickly be booed off the stage. And I want to add that if you've had any training in the audio fields, and when I say training, I mean, I spent my college years hanging out in recording studios with friends. That's how I met this guy. You can quickly pick up when somebody's voice has been heavily massaged to sound good. And how I found out about this particular performer was, for the first time, I heard something when Dude and I were watching a performance she did, and I looked at him and I says, is all her stuff this heavily produced? And, or overproduced is the word I believe I used. And overly produced is jargon for throwing lots and lots of crap at it. And forgive the loud thumpings, but Fuzznuts is up wandering around and flicking his tail against the mic. I'm trying to keep him from doing that, but as you can tell, it's not completely successful. Come on, buddy. I so need to get you a girlfriend. Anyways, don't give up on what it is you're working on, even if you're the only one who will ever see it or appreciate it. The world, especially now, as we teeter on the brink of madness, needs art more than ever. And if the only person you save from madness is yourself, that's far better than the alternative. As for my friends, I have done what I can do. I hope it's enough, and I hope that they will both go back to making art again. Okay, let's get to the news.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away.
From religionnews.com, more Me Too lessons as a Buddhist king falls. For some American Buddhists, seeing a photo of Mypham Rinpoche on the front page of the New York Times this week was a shock. Though he's the leader of the largest Western Buddhist organization, Shambhala International, Rinpoche rarely draws attention from the mainstream press. His last appearance in the Times was in 2005 when he ran the New York City Marathon. This time the headline read, "The King of Shambhala Buddhism is undone by abuse report." Certainly those who have found in Shambhala, based in Nova Scotia, a community that offers the promise of well-being and steady inner peace, the allegations that Rinpoche had sexually abused female followers for years are powerfully disillusioning. I'm quoting from this article, but I'll also have a link in the show notes to the New York Times piece it talks about. I'm reading from this article rather than the Times piece because while this article starts out sounding like your typical news story announcing that a religious leader has been caught doing something untoward, it quickly verges into an apologetic for the Rinpoche. And I want to point out that Rinpoche is a title, not the guy's actual name, even though the author of the article treats it like it is his name. It also has me a bit confused as to what's been going on with the organization for decades now, and the Times piece doesn't make it any clearer. When I was wandering my way out of religion, I stumbled upon Buddhism. And, thinking about all the cool shit Buddhist-type monks do in the movies, like the concept of the Jedi was inspired by samurai warriors who tended to be Buddhist, I started digging around in it. As luck would have it, there was actually a Buddhist temple not far from where I lived. This was a Tibetan Buddhist temple, and was a bit different than the Zen Buddhism so popular in America. One of the things that they had in common was that the monks were celibate. Now, Mithram, or however you pronounce his name, wasn't just an ordinary monk. As a Rinpoche, he was roughly equivalent to a bishop in the Catholic Church. He was also married. That's highly unusual, to say the least. Even more unusual is that his father was also a Rinpoche. Methinks we're getting a bit far from the kind of Buddhism espoused by the Dalai Lama. The author of the article, who tells us this in the third paragraph, is not merely a Tibetan Buddhist, but also a psychotherapist. And rather than explaining how a guy who's supposed to be celibate could be married and running one of the largest Buddhist organizations in the West, she tries to gently excuse his actions and those of his father, who apparently also had a number of sexual abuse allegations against him, by blaming it on the father's supposed PTSD. Not that she calls it this, she simply refers to it as trauma. And rather than saying people who suffered trauma need to get professional mental help, she just says that folks shouldn't hold their leaders in such high esteem that they are willing to overlook their transgressions. Which is an improvement over what the Catholic Church has done, but again fails to address how a guy who seemingly violated the fundamental requirements of being a monk and a Rinpoche could be taken credibly by anyone in the religion. The celibate monk tradition goes all the way back to the Buddha, so it's not like how the Catholic Church was officially fine with married priests until the Middle Ages, and then suddenly decided that all of them had to be single and celibate. From Tennessean.com, pastor who allegedly raped underage girl said he thought it was consensual, Tennessee police say. A Tennessee pastor was arrested Sunday and charged with aggravated statutory rape and sexual battery by an authority figure, according to a Newport Police Department report. James Ronnie Messer was arrested at 11 p.m. Saturday after a family member told police a 17-year-old girl had been raped by the pastor. Now, credit to the police and the parents of the victim in that they took her account seriously and had the pastor arrested. As we all know, too many times such things are covered up. Hopefully, this is a sign that the Me Too movement is having an impact and that it's less likely people will be able to get away with such things in the future.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Asps. Very dangerous. You go first.
From SmithsonianMag.com. Oldest Greek fragment of Homer discovered on clay tablet. The epics of the Greek poet Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, have been recited around campfires and scrutinized by students for 2,800 years, if not longer. But you might think that ancient copies of these books are dug up in Greece all the time, but that's not the case. The ancient papyrus these books were written on rarely survives, meaning that ancient copies of Homer from the lands he wrote about simply don't exist. But now, reports the BBC, archaeologists in Greece have found 13 verses from the Odyssey chiseled into a clay tablet dating to the 3rd century AD or earlier, representing the oldest lines of the poet found in the ancient land. kind of funny that they call Greece ancient since, the land there is as old as any other part of the planet. The tablet was discovered near the ruins of the Temple of Zeus during 3 years of excavations in the ruins of the ancient city of Olympia on the Greek peninsula, the Peloponnese. The verses are from the epic's 14th book, in which Odysseus speaks to his lifelong friend Eumaeus, the first person he sees on his return from his decade away from home. And actually, it's decades away, since he was at war for 10 years and then spent 10 years trying to get home. In a press release, the Greek Cultural Ministry says that the preliminary date of the text has been confirmed. If verified, it will be a priceless literary and historical artifact. In fact, any glimpse into Homer before medieval times is rare, and any insight into the composition of the epics is precious. It's believed that the Odyssey and the Iliad come from an oral storytelling tradition. Whether the stories were composed by a blind poet named Homer is a source of debate, though many researchers believe Homer was probably not a historical individual, but a cultural tradition that developed the stories over many decades or centuries, with scribes writing them down sometime around the 8th century BC. As a fan of the Odyssey, I was surprised to learn that the oldest complete copies we have date from medieval times. This fragment is thought to date from the 4th century CE, which means that it was written roughly 1,000 years after the original tale was first composed. Now, we do have older fragments, but those were all found in Egypt, and the oldest of them date from about the 3rd century BCE, which puts them at about 500 years after Homer's time, and Homer was describing events which are thought to have happened some 400 years before he lived. Which is kind of mind-blowing if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey, because many of them have a very you are there kind of feel to them. I realize it's not terribly different than a movie set in ancient Greece or Rome, but the tale of the Trojan War survived for over 400 years simply as an oral tradition. It's not like Homer came up for the idea from reading about it in a history book or poking around in some ruins. It was just a tale which had been told for centuries. Originally, I was going to use the BBC article that this story references, but this one has far more information in it, including a link to a site where scholars are attempting to compile all the different ancient versions of Homer's works and give a fuller reconstruction of what the tale was like. I'd really like to see how the different versions compare with one another. From newsobserver.com, archaeologists uncover 1,600-year-old revolutionary clues to life in ancient Jewish village. A University of North Carolina archaeologist and her team have uncovered 1,600-year-old art in a monumental synagogue in Israel that could rewrite history about an ancient Jewish village. The team, led by Professor Jody Magnus, discovered mosaics in an ancient village in Israel that contradict widespread views about Jewish settlement in the region during the early 5th century. The size and rich decoration of the synagogue indicate that this Jewish village continued to flourish in the centuries after the Roman Empire became a Christian empire, and these Jews came under Christian rule, which many scholars today view as having been oppressive to the Jews, said Magnus, a Kennan Distinguished Professor of Early Judaism in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill College of Arts and Sciences. The large, elaborately decorated interior of the synagogue in Huqaq, a village in Galilee, points to a previously unexpected level of prosperity, and the content of the mosaics themselves seem to contradict previous historical perceptions. The article points out that they were surprised to see human and animal figures in the mosaics, because it was thought that Jews at this time took the whole "thou shalt not make any graven image" commandment seriously and only did abstract artwork. Nope. This stuff wouldn't seem out of place in any Roman ruin from the era, other than the subject matter such as Noah's Ark. Sadly, it doesn't look like they found any forgotten biblical works in the ruins or in the mosaics.
Have you done this before?
Of course. Hundreds of times.
With party members?
Yes.
Inner party members?
Not with those bastards. Though there's plenty who would.
Look, I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone corrupt.
Well, I ought to suit you then. I'm corrupt to the core.
Okay, now I'm going to get into the part of the episode where I start asking questions that I don't have answers to, and I don't know of anybody who does. Tech reporter Ed Bott, who is one of the rare tech reporters who actually has an in-depth understanding of technology, retweeted a thread by a guy who breaks down Mueller's latest indictment. That's the one which incriminates 12 Russian spies for hacking the 2016 election. Bott marvels at the depth of information contained in the indictment and wonders how we got this information. Here's why. Because in order to get the information contained in the indictment, someone had to do some very sophisticated work. If Mueller's team only recently, as in since the start of the investigation, got hold of this material, they managed to reconstruct things that you wouldn't expect them to be able to do at so late a date. We're talking about things like what and when the Russian spies searched for when they were hacking the election. If you're a Russian spy, I don't think you're going to be using a search engine like Google without covering your tracks, so Google has no idea of who you are. If you're going to be using Google at all, I think that it was much more likely that they'd use either a Russian search engine company or a service like DuckDuckGo, which claims that they keep no records of your searches or anything which can personally identify you. The indictment also includes descriptions of Bitcoin transactions to pay for things like VPN service, web hosting, and paying for information or promotion. It becomes painfully clear from the analysis of the indictment that the Russians ran a very sophisticated operation against the DNC, even monitoring the DNC's computer activity in real time. Nowhere in the indictment, and I'll have a link to the full indictment in the show notes, does it say how and when Mueller and his team got this information. Some of it could have been found out when the DNC turned their computers over to the FBI, but other things like the search history of the hackers, that's going to be hard to get. And when did they get it? We know that the government has large data centers which do nothing more than archive massive amounts of internet traffic. We're talking about terabytes on the hour worth of data. So much so that one of their data centers suffered a meltdown because the equipment overheated from all the data it was copying. We know this because of the stuff Edward Snowden leaked back in 2013. The response by every major internet company out there was to start encrypting everything. The government isn't supposed to be able to crack this encryption. It is fairly safe to assume that all the internet traffic of the Russian hackers was encrypted. So let's work through a possible path that Mueller's team might have taken. Armed with data gathered from the DNC's computers, they called up the folks at the NSA and requested a bunch of information and data from them. The data was encrypted. So how did Mueller's team decode it? Were the Russian spies using some kind of weakened encryption mandated by the Russian government that the U.S. can crack? Possible, but one would think that since that a significant portion of the traffic passed through VPNs based outside of Russia, that this couldn't be cracked, unless those VPNs were lying about the level of security they could provide their customers, and I'd think that the Russians would have the ability to find out just how secure their connections were. If, however, the Russians were using the best encryption out there and the U.S. government could crack it, this raises some worrying issues, especially when you have a Republican-controlled Congress which is more than happy to let Trump do whatever he wants. Because if the NSA can crack supposedly unbreakable encryption, this means the very foundations of our democracy are at risk. As you should know from the seemingly endless streams of scandals pouring out of the White House, this administration has little care for the rule of law, which means that they'd have no problem with hacking into the computers of every Democratic candidate out there and using the information gained to defeat them in the coming elections. After all, if you know what your opponent's next ad is going to be before they ever release it, you can have a response ready to go the moment theirs goes public. You can also plant false and incriminating documents on their systems or embed them in leaks of legitimate documents to give them an air of authenticity. Now I'm going to make the waters even murkier. The official story we've been given is that the FBI was alerted to Russian meddling in the election when, in May of 2016, an Australian politician alerted them that George Papadopoulos of the Trump campaign had bragged to him that they'd gotten all kinds of dirt on Hillary. The FBI then launched a serious investigation and ramped up their efforts when it became publicly known that the DNC had been hacked. We don't know what information the FBI was able to uncover at this point, but we do know that they had enough to be confident that the Russians were meddling in things. And this could be as simple as just seeing suspicious web traffic without knowing the contents of that traffic. Or they could have actually been able to monitor everything that the Russians were doing in real time. We know that the Dutch were monitoring a different group of Russian spies in real time at this point. It's fairly safe to assume that the Dutch were passing on this information to the U.S. government. And please forgive me if I sound like I'm being a conspiracy theorist here. I'm just trying to piece together information in the most logical way based on the limited details which have come to light so far. It's kind of critical that we know the details of how and when Mueller's team got this information. As I said, there are some rather worrying implications if the government can crack encryption. It's also unsettling if companies which are saying that they keep our data secure and in such a manner that they can't turn over useful information to the government are lying about this. Because again, if that's the case, then the corrupt members of the GOP can get access to things they shouldn't be able to and use it to undermine candidates for office. Now we know that as the election drew close, Obama had strong evidence that the Russians had a large operation going on to undermine the election. Obama shared this information with Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, as well as the Trump and Clinton campaigns. Obama wanted to issue a joint statement describing what the Russians were doing, but the Republicans refused to agree to this. Again, we don't know any of the details of this information. It could be as simple as the volume and types of web traffic, possibly some unencrypted documents, or it could have been more. And whatever information Obama would have been given by the FBI and others wouldn't have been as detailed as what those agencies actually had. After all, they're not going to provide the president with thousands of pages of material for him to pursue. They're going to give him a concise summary of all that material. Now, I'm running out of time here, as yesterday, when I had planned to put this episode together, I had to go into work, and then when I got off work, the power went out, and stayed out until it was about time for me to go to bed. Get up today, start working on the episode, and I get a text saying I have to come in. So I cannot discuss this in the kind of depth that I really would like to. I know someone who is an expert on computer matters, especially as they relate to government security, and I've reached out to them to see if they can provide more insight on this matter. But I want you to think about the worst case scenario which this indictment raises, and I haven't mentioned it so far. It's possible that when Obama was briefed about the Russian hackings, he didn't have the level of information that is contained in the Mueller indictment. We don't know, and we don't know why he didn't have that level of information. Maybe it was because the FBI didn't have it yet, which again raises the question of how they got it. Or maybe the FBI didn't give it to Obama, which raises the question of why they didn't hand it off to him. Maybe they didn't think that he'd be able to understand it. Maybe the person providing the information was inept. Maybe it was a mistake, or possibly the people who had direct knowledge of this were very pro-Trump and declined to pass it along. We don't know. Now, however, comes the deeply troubling part. What if the FBI did have all this information at that time, and they did pass it along to Obama, and he shared it with the Republicans? Not only would this mean that they knew exactly what the Russians were doing and chose to say nothing about it, but it also means that Obama decided it was better to say little than to put all this information out there for the public to analyze. Until Trump took office, historians have all agreed that James Buchanan was the worst president in the history of the U.S. Since I'm sure many of you have no clue as to who Buchanan was, I will explain. And don't think that it's a failing if you're not familiar with him. He's rarely talked about in U.S. history because his successor was far more famous. Buchanan was Abraham Lincoln's predecessor, and the reason that Buchanan is considered the worst president in U.S. history isn't so much that he was the guy in charge when the country started literally tearing itself apart. It's that he didn't care that the people in his administration were looting the U.S. military in order to equip the Confederacy. Now, obviously, Obama is a very patriotic person, and he was a good president, so I'm not trying to say that he didn't care. I'm sure he did. But if he had the kind of information in the Mueller indictment and didn't come forward, that's an epic miscalculation on par with Neville Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement. And if you're a longtime listener of the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast, you'll know that Chamberlain actually had very good reasons for signing the Munich Agreement, because he knew that there was no way that Britain could fight a war in 1938. What he didn't know was how weak the German military was in 1938. History doesn't remember that, however. All history remembers is that he was willing to give Hitler what he wanted. It would be a shame if future historians treated Obama the same way. I just hope the answers we get after Mueller wraps up his investigation show that Obama did the right thing, and that the answers to my questions don't impugn anyone too greatly. But I just don't see how that's possible right now. And I am less concerned about Obama having made a mistake. In other words, let's say that he assumed that, well, as bad as all this information he had was, the odds of Hillary winning were so great that there really wasn't any reason to worry about it if that information didn't get out to the public. Obviously, that would be a wrong statement. That doesn't bother me greatly. I mean, it's a little concerning that he was not willing to take a bold move and just say, okay, here's everything we have. The Republicans refuse to agree that this is a serious problem, but I'm releasing it so that the American people can decide for themselves. I think that would have been the best move on his part. And that may be something that one can only know in hindsight. But if Mueller was able to get this information by cracking encryption, and it's not some kind of disabled encryption that the Russians are using, but it's the same encryption we are promised by Google, Apple, all the big companies out there, is unbreakable by anyone, then we've got real problems. Because again, if you've seen anything about the Helsinki conference today, you know that we have a president who is more than happy to sell us out to the Russians, and we have a Republican-controlled Congress which does not seem to have any interest in doing anything about this. Okay, I've got to wrap this up because I have to get ready for work. As much as I hate to. I apologize for the shortness of the episode, but I'm sure you all can understand, and I wish I had some answers for you on these things, because, again, it is really, really concerning. Both, in the level of knowledge that the government may have had in 2016, as well as to the government's ability to access what is supposed to be very private data. I will talk to you all next week.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.